Welcome to Oil Painting Question and Answers, episode number 18. Before we get into the question, I thought I'd show you guys my setup when I paint. We've had some questions about that, and I thought I'd just show you exactly how I set everything up when I'm painting. And this is actually something that's very important. It will make a big difference in the quality of your work. I didn't always paint like this. It's kind of something that I evolved into. But I've really found that this setup makes all the difference. And if you have everything in easy reach and all around you, it just makes it easier to work. Not only easier, but you actually paint better. And so let me just start. On my right here, I've got a little work table, and I've got my Geneva brush holder on it, which are now available, by the way, for sale. And underneath the brushes, I've got some brush dip, some paint, all my paint tubes. But I can put anything here, anything that I'm going to use while I'm actively painting. Then I've got my palettes just to the right of my canvas, and I've got a palette table with two palettes on it, and that's just exactly right there where I'm painting. It's not back here where I have to turn around and spin. And then over here on my left is my photo holder, and the photo holder is just right up next to the canvas. And that's something, this is the biggest mistake that I see people make, and it's a really big deal, is they'll have their photo off to the left, or they have it pushed at a different angle, or whatever it is. But by having it just exactly next to your canvas, not only is your photo in the same amount of light, or close to the same amount of light as your canvas, which is important. It's not over here in the shadows where it's very different. It's going to make it a lot harder to judge your color. But also it's just right there, so that when I'm looking, I'm just turning my head that much, and that makes a huge difference when you're painting. The other thing is that when I have this photo holder here, not only is it as close to my canvas, the photograph is actually even taped to the right edge so that it's as close as it can possibly be. But also, when I'm sitting at my chair and I'm sitting here comfortably, this photo holder is perpendicular to my line of sight. And what that means is it's not flat, it's not rotated around like that. It's not rotated even more. It's perfectly perpendicular, just like my canvas. So my canvas is perpendicular to my line of sight, and my photo holder is. And that's why it's at an angle like that. So there's my photo holder. And if you're working from life, your shadow box is going to go right in the spot where your photo holder is, except it's going to be about 4 feet away from you, like it is here in this video where I painted this dry grass. And then further to my left, I've just got another small table where I keep tools and non-essential things. I've got my cup of tea there, and underneath it are some paper towels, a little trash can. And that's everything. There's one other thing that I use, and it's actually it's something that I miss a lot when I'm filming, but normally I have a paper towel holder. What that does is, and I don't use it for filming because as you can see, it's a big white bright square and it kind of ruins the shot. But normally I'll have a paper towel holder which holds my paper towel right above my palette. And I don't see a lot of artists use that, but it really makes a difference because now when I'm sitting here painting, I'm on my canvas, I'm on my palette, and I'm on my paper towel holder wiping my brush off because I'm always wiping paint out of my brushes. And so having the paper towel holder there, palettes here, photograph holder to my left, it's all real tight and close. And I'm using a Geneva easel, which is nice because it gives me lots of leg room. It allows me to bring my palette table in close, so that's an advantage. A lot of traditional easels, you've got all the wood and the legs coming way out, so you're stepping on everything. So this makes it nice, but this setup and the way that I have it set up really makes a big difference. And I see a lot of my students, and they'll have their palette back here on a flat table, their palette's white, it's just all jumbled up. And when you're sitting here turning and moving and everything's in different light, it'll affect your work and you don't even realize that it's doing it. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. That's how I set everything up. Oh, and I should mention, if you want to find out more, I have another video called How to Set Up an Artist Studio. It explains exactly where to position your light, at what angle relative to your canvas, and also how to just deal with glare in general. So let me just talk about brush holders very briefly. This brush holder here which you can make for yourself. I'm going to be releasing a video very, very soon on how to make these for yourself. They're real easy, and you can just hold your brushes in the same way that this Geneva brush holder does. The advantage to the Geneva brush holder, if you don't want to make one yourself, is that it keeps your brushes up high so that you can still use your table. Normally if the brushes are down low like they would be with this handmade one, it ends up taking over your tabletop. And this allows you to keep stuff underneath it. This is an unpainted one. You put weights, rocks, gravel, pennies, something heavy in there, and that way you can even stack a whole bunch of heavy brushes on this end and it's not going to tip over, and it just gives it a lot of weight so it doesn't slide around when you're using it. And by the way, we have some of these. We just started to sell brush holders, and we had some in our production that had very small flaws, cosmetic flaws, and we're going to be selling those while they're available for half off. So you might want to go to Geneva Fine Art and check out these half-off brush holders that we're going to sell while they're still available. Anyway, so that's the new Geneva brush holder. Let's get into some questions. Why do you prefer to light your still life setup from above rather than from the side? And do you have any preferences for framing or using gallery wrap or painting on a solid panel that doesn't need framing? Yeah, as far as lighting your still life setup from above or from the side, I don't really think I have a preference. I think the reason that a lot of my still lifes that I set up or whatever, it just so happens that my shadow box, it's just real easy to put the light up top because of my space and for filming and for a lot of reasons. Certainly when I was doing a workshop, I didn't have the space to light all the shadow boxes from the side, so we had the lights up top. But I would actually encourage you to try different setups, or rather, let's say you set something up, try lighting it from the side if you've got the space, and if you like that better, then by all means use the light from the side. I think that's there's really no reason why I do it from the top other than saving space, and it's kind of how the shadow box that I use works. As far as the gallery wrap goes, if you're using pre-stretched canvases and you want to buy the gallery wrap type, I don't see any reason why not to do that. Personally, if I really want to, if I have a painting and it really is one that I like a lot, then I'll usually take the time to get a frame built for it or have it framed myself. But, I certainly have a lot of paintings in my house that don't have frames on them, so I understand that. But I just don't really mind the staples, I guess, because I think that eventually I'm going to frame all of them, which I probably never will. But yeah, it's just a personal preference thing. If you're stretching your own canvases, it's really a lot harder, I think, probably. Maybe I don't know a technique, but doing the gallery wrap yourself is probably a lot harder than just stretching it the normal way where you put the staples along the edge. So that's how I do it, but it's really a personal preference thing. Should an oil painting be displayed before it has been varnished? There's not a rule that you can't do that, that you can't display paintings before they're varnished, but certainly when I was doing my portraits, I would never show a client their portrait before it was varnished, because I didn't want to have to explain that all these flat areas over here in the dark or in the dress or whatever will all come back to life once I varnish it. So what I would do is usually keep my painting in a warm location, a warm, dry location, and that would speed the drying up considerably instead of keeping it in a cool spot, for instance. And I would just take the time to let it dry, and then I would put a nice gloss varnish on it before I really put it on display. But, I understand sometimes you can't help it, and you need to display it before then. And if you're going to do that, I would oil it out, like I explained in the video about oiling out paintings, and do that if you really have to. But the best thing is just to finish a painting, let it dry thoroughly for, a month and a half, 2 months, minimum, 3 months preferably, and then put a nice gloss varnish on it. But that's kind of a long time to wait. But if you put it in a warm spot, it'll significantly speed that up, where you may even only have to wait like 2 or 3 weeks if it's a warm enough spot, like up in a real, warm attic during the summer. Do you clean the surface of your painting between sessions? Also, do you have any tips on how to avoid teeny bits of dust and particles getting stuck onto the painted surface? You know, it's never really been a problem for me. Well, the one thing that you definitely don't want to do is have any movement of air. So if you've got a vent that's actually causing air to move into your painting or across your painting, then that's going to constantly be bringing little particles of dust or bits of hair or lint or whatever it is, and they'll come, and as it moves across your paint, they end up getting stuck. So you don't want a lot of air movement. You know, you don't want a fan blowing or anything like that. The other thing is that when you do store your paintings, store them with the painted side down, you know, leaning against a wall or in some kind of way that the painted surface is face down and it won't collect dust as it falls. I certainly don't clean my surface of my paint between sessions. You know, I always work in wet paint, so I couldn't clean them even if I wanted to. If a painting's been sitting over in the corner and I haven't worked on it for several months and I pull it out again, the best way to clean a painting that I've found is you don't want to get in there and, you know, scrub the surface at all, because you could disturb the paint, you know, the paint surface, you know, and scratch it up or something. So you don't want to do that. But what I would do is I would get a very soft synthetic kitchen sponge that has never been used and just rinse it out with good, clean, clear water and just get it very slightly damp. You know, wring it out just as much as you can possibly wring it out. And then just drag an edge over the painted, the dry painted surface that's been sitting there collecting dust or whatever, and let that sponge, that very, very slightly damp sponge, pick up all that dust and lint or whatever it is. But you don't want to get in there and scrub it or anything, or certainly don't want to get like a big wet sponge or anything. It's just a very, very slight damp sponge that I just pull an edge over. And when I do that, I'll tilt the painting slightly face down. In other words, here's the painted surface, and I do it like that. And that way, if I bump any little bits of lint, they're just going to fall. They're not going to tumble down. If I had it lean this way, or on a flat surface, for instance, you just push it around, and if you knock anything loose, it's just going to tumble down or just stay in the paint. So upside down, drag a soft, very damp sponge across the surface. And that's what I always do before I varnish my paintings, just in case there's little bits of lint or whatever. Oh, and by the way, when your painting is on your easel, it should not be leaning back. That is the number one way that you collect dust. Your painting should be perfectly vertical when it's on its easel. I am sensitive to smells, so I love the sound of the solvent-free paint. Are Geneva paints non-toxic? As far as the toxicity goes, you know, I don't want to say that they're not toxic, because there's a lot of definitions for toxicity, and you get into all kinds of legal, you know, issues with saying things are not toxic or that they are toxic. But let me just tell you about the paint. The only thing in it that gives off any smell that's discernible at all is the oil of cloves. And the oil of cloves is something you can buy in health food stores. You know, people use it for aromatherapy. It's natural. You know, it smells pleasant to me anyway, and to most people, I think. But it's actually very mild, and it's nothing like working around solvents. You know, when I used to come home, my wife paints in our house, and she paints just right in the middle of the house. And before, when she was using paint that had solvent in it, it was real easy. You know, open the door, and instantly I knew she was painting, because the whole house would have that smell in it. But now that she's using the Geneva paint, I can't even tell that she's painting unless I walk over and notice that she's got her palette out or her canvas out or whatever. So it's very, very different, not having the solvents in there. And so I love it. And then I didn't even realize how much I liked having a solvent-free studio until we phased out all the old paint that I was using last year, and I started using this Geneva paint. And it's just wonderful. I mean, you know, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more sensitive to the smells. Like I notice a lot of people have reported the same thing. And so now when I'm around mineral spirits, it's just sort of like, ugh, you know, because now that I'm using the Geneva paint, it's just wonderful. And the one thing about the paint is, you know, all our paint is you know, it's linseed oil based. So therefore, the linseed oil doesn't put out any unpleasant smells. It's just vegetable oil. And then the other thing is, the pigments that are mixed into them are all non-toxic. The only exception to that is the cadmium, but the only way the cadmium, this is the cadmium pigment, this is not all cadmiums, old cadmium from 50 years ago and whatever, but the modern cadmium pigments are made in such a way that they're not absorbed through the skin, they're not absorbed even if you ingest them, your body just passes them through and it doesn't get into you. So, and that's the kind of pigment we use, and I think that's the same kind of cadmium most of the big manufacturers use. But the point is that this cadmium, it's not going to hurt you if you get it on your skin, and the only way it's going to hurt you is if you paint it on a canvas, let that dry, then sand it with dry sandpaper so that you create a dust, and that dust gets up in the air somehow, and then you inhale that into your lungs. That would be a way that you could hurt yourself with this paint. But as long as you're not sanding it or using an aerosol sprayer and spraying it up in the air and breathing it in like that, it's not like the cadmium pigment puts off any kind of toxic smells or anything. So it's perfectly safe to use, and I just love it. I didn't know how much I would enjoy not working around solvents until I started using this Geneva paint. So anyway, I hope that answers your question about the toxicity, and I hope you can appreciate why I can't just come out and say, yeah, it's non-toxic, but that's me just telling you kind of, just being as honest as I can about it. When using a photo as a painting source, is it better to have a color photograph or a black and white photograph? Well, the first thing I would say is that if you take the time and you make a decent photograph, you take a photograph and you expose it properly, and we've got a photography guide at drawmixpaint.com that you should go check out. But if you take the time to expose your picture properly, to develop it properly, and to print it in such a way, the right way, you can end up with a color print where the colors are real close to real life or whatever it is you're looking at. And that's the very best thing, because what a photograph really is a stand-in for working from life. And so you really want it to be as close to what you're looking at as possible. Now, working from black and white pictures, the thing about that is, and I actually did a portrait years ago, early in my career, where somebody gave me a black and white picture and then I turned it into a color painting. But I was really glad to have had the experience of mixing colors from life and knowing exactly how to go about doing that. But even then, I felt like I was handicapped, because if you look at a black and white picture, you're not going to know that there's a strong rose color in the cheek, or that the ear is got some redness to it, or whatever it is, or that there's a green reflection up in the forehead. You're simply not getting that information. So even if you're working from a color photograph and maybe the colors aren't right because it wasn't exposed properly or wasn't developed properly or whatever, you're still going to get those clues that let you know where the color shifts are and stuff. So I very much felt like I was handicapped at the time when I was working from a black and white picture, and I was really using all of my experience from mixing colors from life to tell me, well, ears tend to usually have a shift to the red, and the inside of the nostril is, got a lot of red in it, or foreheads tend to be blue-green. And so I was using a lot of that experience to, help me out when I was working from that black and white picture. But it really is a lot harder. So I guess my answer would be no, I don't recommend it. But do keep in mind that it's very important to, if you want great colors, you need to go check out the photo guide, and this is if you're working from a photograph. If you're working from life and you're using a color checker, then you just bypass the whole thing, and your colors are going to look perfect every time, because you're just looking at life and comparing your colors to life. But if you're going to work from a photograph, take the time to learn how to make decent prints, because if you're an artist, you need source material. This is if you're painting realism. And so it's a really big deal, and if you have a print where your colors match what you're looking at, that's ideal, because the photograph is just a stand-in for life. Because obviously there's times when, you just can't work from life, and you have to work from a photograph. So anyway, hope that answers your question. How important is it to use the quick-drying white? Would a regular titanium or zinc white work for staining? I would definitely not use just regular old titanium white out of a tube. I would use a foundation white or a quick drying white, which is another type of, which basically is a foundation white. Stay away from the zinc, because zinc tends to form weaker paint films. But the main thing is that if you use a foundation white or a quick drying white, those paints are designed to be low oil content or low oil percentage. And so that way when you paint on top of that, you're not going to get cracking. If you've got a lot of oil in your foundation white and then you paint something on top that has perhaps less oil or is a faster drying paint, you could get a lot of cracking. So just use a foundation white that's been labeled as a foundation white, or a quick drying white, which is also designed to be used as a foundation white, and stay away from the zinc for sure. In the old days, they used to make all the foundation whites and primers and stains and everything with lead white, which makes really, really good paint films, and lead tends to have low oil percentage as a pigment anyway, so it's the best, but of course it's highly toxic and nobody likes to use lead anymore for good reason. But yeah, don't use a regular titanium, just use the quick drying or another foundation white when you paint your stain on your canvas. How do you go about varnishing if you send a portrait to a customer? Do you have them get it varnished, or do you get them to send it back to you when it's ready to be varnished? Well, what I used to do is I used to keep my paintings, when I would finish them, I would put them in a really warm spot and let them dry, and so that I didn't have to wait 2 months. And then I would varnish them, and sometimes I would probably varnish them sooner than perhaps was ideal, but that's not a really big deal, especially if you're using modern varnishes. But what that would mean is that sometimes, I might have to go back a year later or 2 years later and revarnish a painting. That was just something that I had to do a lot of. And I would never have a client send me the painting just because trying to get a client to put a painting into a crate and have it properly protected, your odds are real small on that, and you're very likely to get a painting that's been damaged or wasn't properly crated or whatever. And crating and painting, crating and sending paintings is always something that, especially big ones, that is better the less you do, the better. So what I would do a lot of times is actually just travel to the client's home, and even if that was a long way away, I did a lot of traveling, and so I typically would just coordinate it in one of my trips or whatever. But that's just something you got to deal with. But the best solution is to keep your paintings in a really warm spot if you've got like a warm attic during the summer or whatever, and let them just kind of dry. They'll dry much faster in a warm spot than they will in a cool spot. But it's not a perfect answer to your question. What are your thoughts on palette types? I've been experimenting with wood versus glass, dark versus light, linoleum, etc. My original thought was that the palette might help me more if it was the same as the tone, ground, or background color, or maybe use glass with construction paper underneath to simulate the same color as my background. Yeah, exactly. It's actually a really big deal, and I did not even realize until late in my career, in fact, just maybe a few years ago when I really started doing some experimenting with color and how much it can affect. But the palette that I'm developing, and this is the Geneva palette, which is not available yet, it's still in development, but it's going to have a dead neutral color as a base, and then it's wood on one side, and this is all bonded together. But that's exactly the idea behind this Geneva palette, is that it has this tone that's the exact same color as the stain that I would stain my canvas, and that way you're not getting thrown by the color. And with the little bit of experimenting that we've done, I was amazed at what a difference it makes in your perception, where if you put if you take like a palette that's, say, shifted more toward the blue, and I put a color on there, the way that I'm going to judge that color, and if you ask me, what does that color look like, I might say it looks gray or whatever, but then I put it on a neutral colored palette, and all of a sudden it looks like it's a completely different color. And so that color perception is hugely affected by that background. But these will be available at some point in the future when we get our whole process down for how we make them and everything. Do you use paint thinner at any point in your paintings, in the underpainting, for example? I don't use any solvents at all in my studio. The only time that I ever use solvents in my painting process is when I put the stain on my canvas, and I've got a free video that explains how I do that. But when I do that, I don't do it in my studio. I do it outdoors or in an open garage, and I let the painting dry out in the garage or somewhere where ventilation is really good. So it's best not to do that in your studio because it will smell it up. The other thing you could do is use an acrylic stain. The only thing about the acrylic is when you put an acrylic stain on canvas, from what I've read and from what I understand, it will loosen the canvas a little bit. So in other words, if you stretch and stain a real tight canvas and then you put an acrylic stain on it, it may loosen the canvas. But the simplest solution for that is just when you buy your canvas roll it out and go ahead and do the whole staining process before you stretch it, and that way when you stretch the already stained canvas, it'll be nice and tight and won't loosen up when you apply the acrylic stain to it. But anyway, that's what I have to say about using solvents. That's the only time I use solvents. When I'm in my studio and I'm actively painting, I don't use any solvents at all. Even the brush dip that I use to keep my brushes fresh is just got safflower oil in it and clove leaf oil, and it doesn't have any mineral spirits or anything like that. So there's no need to. I know that you refer to the color checker and the proportional divider as learning tools first and foremost, but I saw in your maintaining the abstraction video that you still premix plenty of paint to work with. I felt that I understood color enough that I shouldn't need to premix colors and that I was wasting time, but recently after watching your videos, I've taken a little more effort up front to premix, and I think it actually saves time in the end. Do you normally premix even when painting for yourself and not demoing? That's a good question. I think that yeah, I do. I premix a little bit, depending on what I'm doing. But there's certainly nothing wrong with just sitting down and going for it and just doing and not premixing or just mixing them as you go. But I think you're probably right, and I think that's probably why I do a little bit of premixing. And it just kind of depends. If I'm doing a landscape and I get out there and the urge hits me and I want to start putting in some shadow, I'll just start putting in some shadow, and a lot of times I don't do penciling. That video that I did on maintaining the abstraction, I think really the main reason I did any penciling at all was just because I wanted to get the glass vase proportions right. But normally I don't use a proportional divider. I'll just kind of check myself with the end of my brush. You can measure by sliding your thumb up and down, and I'll just do a couple of checks, and maybe I'll do a video on how I do that. But a proportion divider is just so easy to use that a lot of times I'll just give myself a few landmarks. So to answer your question, I think that probably, if you just do a little bit of premixing, like let's say if you're doing a landscape or something and you've got some forest colors, I might give myself maybe 2 or 3 colors that I know I'm going to need, but then I'm going to play with those colors a lot as I work. And if you watch the main point to understand, or the main thing to pick up of how I'm playing with my colors, is if you noticed I did premix some colors, but then I went and really altered them a lot as I painted, and I ended up completely changing sort of the color scheme, but using those basic colors as kind of a foundation. And maybe the best way to think about it is, I start with a real limited palette, and a lot of people say, well, why don't you get pre-mixed colors and then you don't have to mix as many colors or whatever. But I found that colors are so arbitrary that if you give me a tube of pre-mixed colors, the odds are I'll never use it because it's just kind of like a different shade of orange that I'm just never using or whatever. But by using the 5 colors in the simple palette, it doesn't hurt to do a little bit of pre-mixing because you don't have any prepared colors. So the very best palette to start with, so to speak, is a few colors that kind of give you your basic color scheme. It might be like 2 or 3 colors here, 2 or 3 colors there. You're going to need this one color, so you might as well go ahead and mix it. But it's kind of this mix of pre-mixing some, but then leaving some not mixed. And so I don't know. I think it kind of depends on my painting. But I think you're right. I think that by pre-mixing a few colors, it really does save time in the end, and actually makes the painting experience better because you're not having to stop and, prep as much color. But then on the other hand, if you do total premixing, where you're doing the full-on lines of color like I explained in How to Mix Colors, for, and that's for people who are starting out with my method for the first time. And I do recommend mixing full lines of color. And I think if you do that, that's very much a learning thing, but it also can be real tedious. But, if I'm doing a portrait, I'm going to probably premix a lot more color just because I know I'm going to need it. And like you said, it just saves time in the end. If you want to watch more of my free videos, go to drawmixpaint.com and you'll find a complete list of all my free videos. And if you want to find out more about the paint that I use or any of the tools, the brush holder or anything else, go to genevafineart.com. And thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions for me, please leave them in the comments section of this video, and I'll get to as many of those questions as I can in next week's episode.